Chloe Thorne walked into Sentinel Bioformulations on a rainy Monday morning in Portland like she owned the entire block. In a way, she genuinely believed she did. I watched her from the glass corridor outside the main clean room, where I had spent the last 2 hours calibrating our high-precision electronic balances. She was in her late 30s, wearing a tailored navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment on my house in Hillsborough. She held an expensive phone in one hand, typing with manicured nails, and walked with the casual, sweeping confidence of someone who had never had to struggle for promotion or worry about basic utility expenses. She was the CEO's daughter-in-law. She had married Julian Thorne, the CEO's son, just 8 months ago in a lavish ceremony in Napa Valley, and now, without a single hour of training in biochemistry, pharmaceutical compounding, or sterile manufacturing, she was running our operations. My name is Stephen Gable. I was 54 years old when this happened, an age where most corporate executives start looking at you as an expensive liability rather than a source of deep institutional knowledge. I joined Sentinel Bioformulations 19 years ago as a junior formulation chemist, when the company was just a small lab with 6 employees working out of a retrofitted warehouse. I want you to understand what 19 years looks like from the inside of a pharmaceutical clean room. It doesn't feel like a long time when you are passionate about the science. It feels like a succession of busy Tuesdays, a blur of successful batches, failed stability tests, and long nights troubleshooting equipment. And then suddenly you look in the mirror and realize a big chunk of your life has passed. But I loved every minute of it because we did something that mattered. We compounded specialized pharmaceuticals for patients in regional Oregon who couldn't access standard medications. We made custom liquid formulations for pediatric patients in Bend who couldn't swallow pills, specialized pain management transdermal creams for elderly patients in Klamath Falls, and unique allergen-free doses for people in coastal towns who had nowhere else to turn. These were patients with rare metabolic diseases, children with severe allergies to standard binders, and hospice patients who needed precise, custom dosages to manage their final days in comfort. For us, a batch wasn't just a number on a ledger. It was a lifeline for someone whose name we often knew. I remember spending 3 days in the lab, developing a specific preservative-free suspension for a 4-year-old girl in Eugene who had a life-threatening reaction to standard commercial solutions. When you do that kind of work, you don't care about the long hours or the smell of chemicals. You care about getting the dosage right to the microgram. That was the company I joined when I was 35. That was the company I had given my life to. But Chloe Thorne did not care about the patients, the science, or the delicate chemistry of compounding. She was appointed Chief Operations Officer in March. There was no job posting, no interview process, and no announcement to the staff. One afternoon, the outgoing COO, a wonderful woman named Sarah who had mentored me for over a decade and had a deep respect for the lab, quietly packed her desk and left. The next morning, Chloe had Sarah's corner office, her reserved parking space, and a shiny new nameplate on the door that someone had installed overnight. When I asked the HR manager if there had been any selection process or if they had considered internal candidates, she avoided my eyes, looked at her screen, and said the role was filled internally. I told her that Chloe had never worked in a pharmaceutical lab in her life and didn't know the difference between an active ingredient and a binder. The HR manager sighed, clicked her mouse, and said Chloe had a degree in hospitality management and had run a boutique resort in Colorado. I waited for her to tell me it was a joke. She just asked if I had any other questions, and when I shook my head, she returned to her work. The first all-staff meeting Chloe ran was in April. She stood at the whiteboard at the front of the conference room and told us that Sentinel had been operating under a scarcity mindset. She said she wanted to shift us toward a growth-first culture. She used the word pivot 4 times in 11 minutes. I know because I wrote down ticks on my notepad. She talked about scaling revenue, optimizing client touchpoints, and driving efficiency. She did not mention patients once. She did not mention safety, compounding tolerance, or the fact that our products went directly into the bodies of sick people. One of our senior compounding technicians, a quiet man named Keith who had been with Sentinel for 20 years and had a spotless safety record, raised his hand. He asked about the new production targets Chloe had sent out. The targets demanded we increase our batch output by 40% within 6 months. Keith explained that with our current cleanroom capacity and the time required for proper sterilization and air quality cycles, that schedule would make it impossible to guarantee sterile conditions. Chloe gave him a patronizing smile. She told him that was the kind of fixed mindset we were moving away from. Keith looked at me, and I looked at Keith. We both knew what that meant, and we both kept quiet. But the worry in the lab was real. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere changed from a focused, quiet lab to a high-pressure factory floor where speed was valued above accuracy, and any mention of safety was treated as resistance to progress. We were forced to run batches back to back, leaving almost no time for our equipment to cool or for our technicians to perform the required mid-shift cleanings. By June, the pressure in the lab had reached a boiling point. I had submitted 3 detailed written reports to the operations team about the dangers of the new production schedule. In these reports, I detailed how the rapid turnaround times were leading to inadequate sanitization cycles for our compounding hoods. The first report in June pointed out that the clean room autoclaves were being loaded past their certified volume capacity to meet the 40% batch output increase, creating cold spots where bacteria could survive the sterilization process. The second report in July detailed how the temperature and humidity sensors in the clean room were fluctuating beyond acceptable parameters because the HVAC system was not given any rest between runs, risking fungal contamination in our liquid compounds. The third report in August warned that the raw chemical suppliers were being swapped for cheaper, unverified sources to cut costs, which violated our internal safety guidelines. Each report was met with a brief automated email saying my feedback had been received and filed. In July, Chloe reorganized the quality assurance reporting structure. Instead of reporting to the independent technical director, the QA manager now had to report directly to Chloe. It was a massive conflict of interest and a violation of the spirit of FDA compounding guidelines under Section 503A. She wanted to ensure that any batch delays caused by failed quality tests could be overridden by her office to meet the monthly shipment targets. If a batch showed borderline stability, she didn't want it held up for testing. She wanted it packaged and shipped. By August, Chloe took it a step further. She decided to eliminate the pre-batch verification sign-off process. This was a critical verification protocol that our retired chief formulation officer, Dr. Evelyn Sinclair, had created 15 years earlier after a mixing error almost put a patient in the hospital. Dr. Sinclair had retired 2 years ago, and I was the only person left who fully understood the mathematical models behind that verification protocol. I had spent 3 years working with her to refine it, cross-referencing it against state safety standards until it was as close to perfect as possible. It required a double signature verification of all raw material weights and purity levels before a compound could be mixed. It was our shield against human error. Chloe called the protocol legacy red tape that slowed down production. I called it the only thing keeping our patients safe. I tried to explain this to her in a brief meeting, but she told me that we needed to trust the automated systems and that my concerns were outdated. She said that in the modern pharmaceutical landscape, speed to market was the most important metric, and that our competitors were leaving us behind because of our slow verification processes. She explicitly told me that my role was to facilitate growth, not to act as a bottleneck. Then came September. I was called into her office at 9:14 a.m. on a Monday. I remember the exact time because I was in the middle of checking a complex batch of pediatric thyroid medication, and I had to hand my calculations over to Keith. I walked down the hall with my lab coat still on my arm, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. Chloe was sitting behind Sarah's old desk. She had redecorated the room. The photos of Sarah's family and the landscape paintings of the Oregon coast were gone. In their place was a massive framed print that said, "Disrupt or be disrupted." She didn't ask me to sit down. She looked at her laptop, then looked up at me and said, "Stephen, I want to be upfront with you. This is not personal. Whenever someone says those words, it is always deeply personal." She told me that Sentinel was undergoing a structural realignment to streamline operations. She said my role as principal formulation chemist was being disestablished, and my duties would be absorbed by the junior staff and the automated systems. She handed me a white envelope and said HR had prepared my severance package, which included 3 months of pay in exchange for signing a standard release. She added that I was free to use the rest of the day to pack my desk. I looked at the envelope. I looked at this woman who had been at the company for less than a year, who did not know the difference between a suspension and a solution, firing me after 19 years of service. I had worked nights, weekends, and holidays to keep this company afloat. I had trained every single chemist in the building. I had designed the safety protocols that protected our licenses. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Are you aware of the intellectual property assignment provisions in my original 2006 employment contract?" She gave me a smug, dismissive smile. She said, "HR has reviewed all the contracts, Stephen. Everything is in order. We own all the processes used in this facility. You were paid to develop them, and they belong to Sentinel." I nodded slowly. I picked up my lab coat from my chair. I said, "Have a good morning, Chloe." I walked back to my office. I did not argue. I did not yell. I packed my personal items into a small cardboard box, my family photo, a small cactus I had kept on my windowsill for 6 years, and my favorite coffee mug. I said goodbye to Keith, who looked devastated and gave me a quiet handshake. I walked out of the building at 10:48 a.m. carrying my box. I did not cry. I had learned a long time ago that showing your anger only makes your opponents feel powerful. I drove home in absolute silence, watching the rain beat against my windshield, thinking about the 19 years I had just left behind in a cardboard box. I parked in my driveway in Hillsborough, sat in my car for 30 minutes, and just listened to the engine cool. What I did not tell Chloe, and what I decided to let her find out on her own, was a detail that went back to my university days. In 2003, I was 31 years old, finishing my postdoctoral research in pharmaceutical chemistry at Oregon State University in Corvallis. I spent my days in a small, dusty lab on the 3rd floor of the science building, surrounded by spectrometers and glass beakers. For my thesis project, I developed a unique stability testing protocol for multi-compound liquid formulations. It solved a major problem in how small compounding labs measured the shelf life and consistency of customized medications, particularly when active ingredients had different degradation rates and tended to break down when mixed together. My academic advisor had recognized the commercial value of the research and urged me to protect the work. I spent 14 months after graduation refining the mathematical models, running liquid chromatography tests, and drafting the safety parameters. In early 2005, I filed a patent application in my birth name, Stephen Albright. The patent was granted in 2006 as U.S. Patent number 7,894,123. It covered the specific algorithm and chemical testing cycle used to verify that multi-compound formulas remained stable for at least 90 days. In late 2006, I met my wife, Emily Gable. When we got married, I decided to legally take her last name. Her father was a respected local carpenter who had passed away from cancer, and since Emily was an only child, it was important to her family to keep the Gable name going. I legally changed my name from Stephen Albright to Stephen Gable at the Washington County Courthouse. The courthouse was a quiet brick building, and I remember the clerk congratulating us as I signed the paperwork. Emily had tears of joy in her eyes because preserving her father's name meant so much to her family. It was a simple legal step, but it had major consequences years later because in the rush of starting a new life, a new marriage, and a new job, I never updated the name on the patent registration. It remained registered under my birth name, Stephen Albright, in the Federal Patent Database. In 2009, our old CEO, George Miller, was looking for a better way to test our compound stability to satisfy state regulators who were tightening rules on customized medicines. He did a search of the patent registry and found the Albright Stability Protocol. He had no idea Stephen Albright was the Stephen Gable working in his lab until he read the details and recognized the methodology. George called me into his office. We laughed about the name difference, and then we sat down and negotiated a formal licensing agreement. Sentinel agreed to pay me a licensing fee to use the Albright protocol in their daily operations. The 2012 renewal was negotiated during a regional drug shortage, where Sentinel had to rapidly expand compounding of pediatric pain suspensions, and the protocol was vital for distribution. The 2016 renewal happened after the Oregon State Board of Pharmacy conducted a surprise inspection and cited our competitors for compound instability, while Sentinel passed without a single infraction because of my protocol. We renewed the agreement again in 2021. It was a private contract between Sentinel Bioformulations and Stephen Albright. The current license was set to expire on December 31st of this year, just 4 months after Chloe fired me. When I got home, I did not panic. I sat on my porch, drank a glass of water, and called my patent attorney, Joanne Fletcher. Joanne had handled the original patent filing back in 2005 and knew my whole history. She was a sharp, direct attorney who had her office in downtown Portland. She pulled up the patent registry, confirmed that the patent was active and fully owned by me, and looked over the Sentinel licensing agreement. She also researched the state regulations and found that Sentinel's operating license from the Oregon State Board of Pharmacy was contingent on their using an approved stability testing protocol, and that they had listed the Albright protocol as their sole approved method. If they lost the license to use the Albright protocol, they would automatically be in violation of their state pharmacy board license. When I explained that Chloe had fired me without looking at the patent agreements, Joanne let out a short laugh. She said, "Stephen, they are operating on a license that expires in 4 months, and they just terminated the actual owner of the patent. They have no legal right to use your methodology once the clock runs out, and their entire production software is built on it." I told her I had warned Chloe about the IP provisions, but she had dismissed me. Joanne said, "Well, she is about to get a very expensive lesson in intellectual property law. Let's wait until November, and then we will send our notice." I spent the next 2 months working in my garden, reading books and spending time with Emily. It was the first time in 19 years that I didn't have to worry about batch numbers, equipment failures, or regulatory audits. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. But I knew that the storm was coming for Sentinel, and I wanted to be ready when it hit. I spent my mornings drinking coffee and watching the autumn leaves fall in my backyard. Knowing that my silence was the most powerful weapon I had, in late November, Joanne sent a formal letter to Sentinel's legal department and to CEO Gerald Thorne. The letter was simple, professional, and completely devastating. It stated that the licensing agreement for the Albright Stability Protocol, U.S. Patent Number 7,894,123, would expire on December 31st, and that the patent holder, Stephen Albright, did not intend to renew the agreement under the current terms. The letter explicitly warned that any continued use of the protocol in Sentinel's manufacturing, software, or compliance reports after December 31st would constitute willful patent infringement under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271. It attached the original patent certificate, the 2009 licensing contract, and all subsequent renewal agreements. The panic in the executive offices was immediate. Keith texted me that afternoon, saying the legal team had spent 4 hours in a closed-door meeting with the CEO. He said people were running back and forth, looking for my old files. The reason for their panic was simple. The Albright Stability Protocol was not just a side process. Over 19 years, we had integrated it into the core software of our compounding machinery. The compounding machinery was run by an automated Siemens PLC system that had the stability calculations hard-coded into its firmware. Without my proprietary calibration coefficients, which were licensed under the Albright protocol, the system would flag an error and refuse to initiate the mixing cycle. This safety interlock was required by our FDA registration. Without that protocol running, they could not verify the safety of their high-risk batches. Under federal regulations, they could not release a single bottle of compounded medicine to patients without that verification. If they stopped using the protocol, they would have to shut down their entire production line, hire external consultants to write a new protocol, test it for months, and wait for state approval. That process would cost them millions of dollars and destroy their reputation. The safety interlock was a regulatory shield. If the stability math isn't validated, the FDA treats the facility as an unapproved manufacturing site, which carries immediate product seizures. Chloe Thorne tried to fight back. She refused to believe Stephen Gable was Stephen Albright. She told the legal team that Stephen Gable was just a disgruntled ex-employee trying to shake them down. She even tried to hire a local software engineer from Portland to bypass the software interlock in the Siemens PLC. However, the engineer refused the job, noting that modifying patented safety software without the patent holder's permission would violate federal copyright law under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 and expose him to immense personal liability. Chloe then produced a document from my employee file, claiming it was an agreement I had signed in 2006 that transferred all my personal intellectual property to the company. Joanne Fletcher looked at the document Chloe provided. It was a poorly altered version of my original employment contract with a forged signature on the IP addendum page. Chloe had used a PDF editor to paste my signature from a recent performance review onto the old 2006 document. The forgery was easily detected. The signature page had a faint digital watermark from a scanner software that wasn't even released until 2018, while the document was supposedly signed in 2006. Additionally, the forged page was printed on modern 24-pound bright white paper that Sentinel only started purchasing in 2022, whereas our original 2006 records were all printed on older 20-pound off-white stock. The signature did not match my handwriting from that era, and the date on the addendum was from a year when I wasn't even legally using the name Gable. Joanne sent a devastating response to Sentinel's attorneys. She pointed out that under Oregon Revised Statutes, Section 165013, forging a corporate document is a Class C felony. She also explained that under established U.S. contract law, a forged document is void ab initio, meaning it is completely invalid from the moment of its creation and cannot be enforced. She warned them that if they attempted to present this forged document in court, we would immediately file criminal charges against the individual who produced it, and we would seek triple damages for willful patent infringement under Section 284. That was the turning point. Sentinel's external attorneys told Gerald Thorne that they had no legal defense. If they went to court, they would lose, and the company would be ruined. The threat of criminal charges and treble damages under Section 284 made Sentinel's legal team freeze. They advised Gerald that they had to settle with me, no matter the cost, because without my patent, the company could not legally operate for another day after December 31st. They were facing a complete shutdown of their $94 million operation. In early January, we held a meeting at a conference room in downtown Portland overlooking the Willamette River. I sat on one side of the table with Joanne Fletcher. On the other side sat Gerald Thorne and our new technical director, Dr. Neil Hyland, who had been hired from a research hospital in Seattle. Chloe Thorne was not in the room. I was told she had been barred from the meetings by the board of directors. Gerald Thorne looked tired. He was a man in his 60s, and he had built this company with his own hands before handing operations over to his daughter-in-law. He looked at me and said, "Stephen, I am sorry about how things were handled. Chloe was trying to move too fast, and she made a massive mistake." I looked at him and said, "Gerald, I spent 19 years building the safety systems at Sentinel. I did not want this company to fail, and I do not want the patients to suffer. But I will not be treated like a line item on a spreadsheet by someone who doesn't know the first thing about pharmacy." Dr. Hyland, the new technical director, spoke up. He was a highly respected researcher who had read my published papers on compound stability. He explained to Gerald that trying to reverse engineer or replace the Albright protocol would take at least 18 months, and over $2 million in clinical validation testing, during which time Sentinel would have to suspend all operations. He told Gerald that my protocol was the gold standard for compounding safety, and that bypasses were legally impossible. We negotiated for 2 days. The final agreement was a complete victory. We signed a new licensing contract for the Albright Stability Protocol, but this time the licensing fee was increased by 5 times the previous rate, bringing the annual royalty to $80. plus a portion of the batch revenue, along with a lump sum retroactive payment of $40,000 for the period we worked without a contract. Sentinel also agreed to hire me as an independent consultant for a fee of $150,000 per year, structured as a monthly retainer of $12,500, to oversee the safety protocols and perform monthly audits. But my most important condition was about the safety of the lab. I demanded that the pre-batch verification protocols we had developed with Dr. Sinclair be fully reinstated as a permanent, non-negotiable part of the operating procedures. Dr. Hyland agreed immediately. As for Chloe Thorne, the board of directors forced her to resign in February. Her attempt to bypass QA, her attempts to bypass the safety interlocks in violation of FDA rules, and her forgery of the contract had exposed the company to extreme legal liability. The board made it clear that her actions represented a clear breach of fiduciary duty to the corporation and its shareholders, and they threatened to sue her if she did not step down quietly. She left Portland a few weeks later. In March, I was invited to speak at the Pacific Northwest Pharmaceutical Symposium in Seattle. The topic of my talk was intellectual property protection and the value of institutional memory in compounding pharmacies. I stood in front of 300 professionals and talked about my experience. I told them that when a company treats its long-term employees as expenses rather than assets, they lose the very knowledge that keeps their business safe. Keith was in the audience. He had traveled up from Portland to support me. Afterward, we had a coffee, and he told me the lab had returned to its normal, safe pace. The new technical director had bought them new safety equipment and actually listened to their concerns. Gerald Thorne signed the final contract with a look of quiet regret, remembering when he first hired me and how the company had lost its way when it started focusing only on the numbers. He shook my hand warmly and admitted that family loyalty should not have blinded him to operational realities. He said he was glad to have me back, even if it was as a consultant. I am now 55 years old. I work from my home office, reviewing compounding batches for Sentinel and 2 other regional pharmacies that license my protocol. I am also working on a new testing methodology with Oregon State University, and this time, my name is clearly written on every single document. Last week, I received a small envelope in the mail from a family in Klamath Falls. Inside was a card from a mother whose son has a rare compound allergy. She thanked me for making sure their local pharmacy could continue to produce his medications safely and consistently. I kept the card on my desk, right next to the photograph of my family and my favorite coffee mug. Some corporate titles are temporary, but the value of your work and the name you put on it is permanent. It is the only thing that truly lasts in this industry, and I am glad I stood up to protect it.